How far could a society go in the name of justice? From being boiled alive in a giant cauldron to having your body slowly pulled apart on a medieval rack, history is full of punishments that crossed every line. Some of these methods were so cruel that even their own people turned away in horror. In this video, we'll uncover the 5 banned torture methods that still haunt history, with each one getting even worse. Boiling alive was one of the most feared punishments in early legal systems, not just because of its severity, but because of the message it sent. It appeared in different forms across East Asia and parts of Europe, each society using it sparingly, almost reluctantly, as if they knew this method crossed a line few wanted to acknowledge. But when it was used, it wasn't meant to punish quietly. It was meant to shock, warn, and leave a memory that would echo for years. In most accounts, a large cauldron or kettle was prepared with water, oil, or tar. Sometimes it was heated beforehand. Sometimes the liquid started cool and was warmed gradually, a process that added tension for both the condemned and the people watching. And yet, as harsh as this punishment was, one event in England made it even more infamous. It wasn't a long tradition, but a single case that changed everything. In February 1531, Roos worked as a cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher. When members of the household fell ill and 2 people later died after eating the day's porridge, suspicion immediately turned toward him. Roos insisted it was a joke gone wrong, claiming he only intended to add a harmless laxative. But England at that time lived under the growing paranoia of King Henry VIII, a king who believed poison was the fastest way for enemies to reach him. And once Henry heard about Roos, the case shifted instantly. The king declared the incident treasonous and demanded a punishment severe enough to deter anyone from even thinking about poison again. Instead of allowing a regular trial, Henry pushed a special act of parliament that made poisoning high treason and, more importantly, allowed boiling alive as the sentence. On April 15, 1532, at Smithfield in London, the new law was carried out. A large cauldron was prepared, and Roos was brought before a crowd that had never witnessed this punishment in England. Reports say the execution lasted around 2 hours, and many spectators were disturbed by what they saw. Even in a brutal era, people sensed this penalty had gone too far. Public reaction was immediate. Within just a few years, in 1547, the law permitting boiling alive was repealed and never used again. The next method was different. It was quiet, slow, and pulled people apart inch by inch. The rack. This famous device was just a wooden table with ropes. But it was the best tool in history for forcing secrets out of people. The rack was one of the most recognizable torture devices of the medieval world. It looked simple at first glance. A wooden frame, ropes tied to the wrists and ankles, and a turning mechanism that tightened those ropes. But its power didn't come from complexity. It came from pressure, slow, deliberate pressure that created fear long before it created pain. And that fear was the real weapon. The person was secured to the frame, stretched out, and unable to move. Every turn of the handle increased the tension. Joints strained, muscles tightened, the body locked into a position it was never meant to hold. Witnesses described the atmosphere around the rack as silent, heavy, and strangely anticipatory, as if everyone knew the real purpose wasn't the device itself, but the confession that might follow. One of the most tragic stories connected to the rack belongs to Anne Askew. In 1546, Askew was a writer and outspoken Protestant at a time when religious loyalty could determine a person's fate. Officials believed she knew the names of other reformers, and they wanted those names desperately. She was taken to the Tower of London and placed on the rack, and here is where her story takes a turn that shocked even those present. Askew refused to reveal a single name. The pressure continued until she could no longer walk, and she had to be carried to her execution. Her silence became the part of the story people remembered most. The moment when those turning the rack realized she would not break. Rack was eventually banned. Its legacy still shapes how we imagine medieval justice, a system where confessions mattered more than truth, and where pressure was a tool of the state. The rack worked inside dark prison cells. The next method didn't use a cell at all. It used the hot sun and hungry bugs. Scaphism. You might think milk and honey are treats, but in ancient Persia, they were used to trap people in a sticky living trap. Scaphism is one of the most unsettling punishments ever recorded in ancient history. Even today, historians debate how often it was used, or if some descriptions were exaggerated. But one thing is clear, the idea of it was frightening enough to echo through centuries. And unlike many ancient punishments, this one relied less on weapons and more on the environment itself. The method began with a simple setup. The condemned person was placed between two wooden boats or inside a hollow tree trunk, with only their head, arms, and legs exposed. At first, it might look like a crude shelter, but it was anything but safe. They were fed excessive amounts of milk and honey, which were also smeared on the skin, attracting insects and vermin. Over days, exposure to the sun and rain, combined with insects and disease, caused severe dehydration, infections, and sores. The body became weak from constant hunger, thirst, and fever, while relentless bites and stings worsened injuries. Movement was impossible, leaving the victim trapped in a slow, unrelenting cycle of pain and decay. The most famous case connected to scaphism is that of Mithridates, a Persian soldier. According to ancient Greek writer Plutarch, Mithridates claimed credit for killing Cyrus the Younger, the brother of King Artaxerxes. The king did not take the brag lightly. He ordered Mithridates to face scaphism, and ancient records say the process lasted 17 long days. 17 days of sun, exposure, and complete helplessness. Whether every detail Plutarch wrote was true or embellished, the story was terrifying enough to survive thousands of years. Scaphism eventually disappeared from history, leaving behind more questions than answers. That method took weeks to kill someone. The next one was much faster, but it was designed to show the whole country exactly what happens to a traitor. Drawing and quartering, this was the ultimate punishment in England, saved only for the worst crimes. It didn't just end a life, it tore the body into 4 separate pieces. Drawing and quartering was one of the most extreme punishments ever used in medieval England. Even today, historians still pause when describing it, because the process was not just harsh, it was designed to send the message that treason would never be tolerated. It began in the 1200s and was used for centuries, long after many other brutal practices had disappeared. And once the sentence was announced, everyone knew the outcome would be unforgettable. But even then, the worst part was still ahead. The punishment unfolded in several stages. First, the condemned person was drawn to the place of execution. This meant being tied to a horse and dragged through the streets. Crowds gathered to watch, and each turn in the road increased the tension. Once the prisoner reached the execution site, the next step followed. A hanging took place, but often the person was cut down before death. After the hanging came the final stage, the quartering. In some cases, this meant the body was separated into parts after death. In other cases, horses were used to pull in opposite directions. Records made it clear that this punishment was reserved for only one crime, treason. The goal was to show the entire kingdom what happened to those who threatened the crown. Every step was intentional, and for centuries, the memory of these executions shaped how people thought about loyalty, rebellion, and power. The most famous person sentenced to this punishment was Sir William Wallace, the Scottish knight known for resisting English rule. In 1305, he was captured, taken to London, and convicted of high treason against King Edward I. Wallace's execution followed the traditional stages. He was dragged through the city, partially hanged, and then subjected to the final parts of the sentence. His head was placed on London Bridge, and his remaining body parts were sent to different cities as a warning. Whether people admired him or feared him, no one forgot what happened that day. By the 1800s, even a harsh era decided this punishment had gone too far. It was officially abolished in 1867. But if drawing and quartering relied on public shock, the next method used something far smaller and far more unpredictable: a very scared animal. Rat torture was one of the most fear-inducing methods ever recorded, not because it relied on heavy machinery or elaborate devices, but because it weaponized something people already fear: desperation. The method typically involved placing a live rat against a person's body, trapping it under a container, and then heating the container so the animal panicked and tried to escape. The threat alone was often enough to break someone mentally, long before anything physical happened. One of the earliest documented uses comes from the Dutch revolt in the 16th century, where rebel leader Diederik Sonoy reportedly employed this method on Spanish prisoners. Records from the time say captives would confess almost instantly out of fear, though individual victims were rarely named. Centuries later, rat torture resurfaced under several 20th-century South American dictatorships, especially in Chile and Argentina, where security forces used psychological terror during interrogations. In 1981, Amnesty International recorded testimony from an anonymous female prisoner in Chile. who described being held in a room filled with live rats as a way to intimidate her into cooperating. Her account became one of the most widely cited modern examples of how the method evolved into psychological torture rather than a physical one. Looking back, it is terrifying to realize how thin the line is between justice and sadism. These 5 methods remind us that fear has always been the ultimate weapon of the state. Which of these methods do you think was the most terrifying? Let us know in the comments below.